From 12 News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Ted Nesi. Tim White is off this week. Later on in the show, we're going to meet one of the candidates running for governor of Massachusetts, Democrat Ben Downing, and hear why he thinks he can beat Charlie Baker if Baker seeks a third term next year. But first, with COVID-19 cases rising quickly in Rhode Island, I'm joined by Tom McCarthy, who's one of the top state officials fighting the pandemic as executive director of Rhode Island's COVID response. Tom, thanks for being here. It's a busy time, I know.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
So, Tom, obviously, we have to start with the data. In recent weeks, cases have jumped from about 15 a day to well over 200 in Rhode Island. Hospitalizations were down around 20 for a while, I would say. Now we were up to 89 at the time we're taping this show. How concerned are you about those trends?
Yeah, I'd say we're at a critical point in our pandemic response here. So with Delta variant, we know that has been devastating parts of the country that are under-vaccinated. In Rhode Island, some of the things that I'm confident about are high vaccination rates that I think set the conditions for us to weather this Delta storm well. Our vaccination rates are good, but not good enough for Delta. So we're watching those rising cases closely. The good news here is we have the solution now in vaccinations and an effective treatment. We also know what works with regards to mitigating your risk of contracting COVID, wearing masks, everything we've done in schools. So while I'm confident in that, I think it's critical that we're all vigilant in Rhode Island over the next month to 2 months, because we would anticipate that our peak in cases is going to be sometime early September, also when schools open. Now, we know how to do this, and we know how to do this well, but we know everyone's tired, continuing to do the right thing over the next month and a half to weather what should hopefully be the last major impact from this pandemic, given what we know today.
Now, you know, we watched Delta take off in places like India, which had very low vaccination rates. And I think there was a perception, at least in the Northeast, that because vaccination rates here are high, that we might be spared. When did you start to realize, all right, this is going to be a bigger headache for us than maybe we had hoped in May?
Yeah, I would say early on, once we saw the spread in India, we definitely started to focus on how do we prepare for a similar type event. Then it moved into the UK and Israel that had very similar vaccination rates that we have today. The UK is a bit further along in their pandemic. So what we saw there, and we're also seeing here, is a decoupling between cases and deaths because we've vaccinated those that are most vulnerable. The vaccines are fantastic at keeping people alive and keeping them out of the hospital. Once we saw it start to take hold in under-vaccinated parts of the United States, we knew it was just a matter of time. So essentially, what period during the fall? Now we know, and I think we're prepared for it, but we still need, Rhode Islanders to continue to step up, get vaccinated, ensure we have the right policies in place in schools. We did this last year so that we can keep kids in school safely in September, and we'll be on the backside of this end of September into October.
You know, masks, you mentioned it, has become, I think, even more fraught than it was last year for all the people who don't want them to come back, who are frustrated about that. On Thursday, the McKee administration ordered masks to begin being worn in all state facilities once again as of Friday, which is when we're taping today. I hadn't necessarily seen that coming listening to the briefing earlier in the week. Why was the decision made, even though I presume there's a fairly high vaccination rate among state employees?
Yeah, the big change was some of the emerging science that we saw coming from the CDC with a local outbreak really in Provincetown, where what changed fundamentally was that we saw that there's a higher possibility of those that are fully vaccinated to spread COVID-19. And we saw, a large number of cases in Provincetown. No, they're typically mild, typically not hospitalized, but it contributes to that overall community transmission pool. And in Rhode Island, while our vaccination rates are very high, among the highest in the nation, we still have children younger than 11 that are unvaccinated, and we still have communities that we're highly focused on that are under-vaccinated.
Which are the most concerning ones to you?
Woonsocket is always top of mind for me. Providence and Pawtucket. There's about 18 communities that we're specifically focusing on during back to school to try and drive those vaccination rates as high as we possibly can. All those that have the adolescent vaccination rates less than 50%. but some of the traditional areas that we've been focusing on, throughout the pandemic.
So going back to masks, I got questions from people when I put a story up yesterday that the mask mandate was coming back to state government, and some people saying, is there going to be a statewide indoor mask mandate again as there was? There are some places doing that, though I don't know that I'd say it's common yet nationwide. Is that being discussed?
We are keeping all of the options on the table. What I would say is, we're in a position where we can impact the next 30 to 60 days. And I think what we want to begin with is we have done enough. We've vaccinated enough Rhode Islanders. We have the testing infrastructure in place, the case investigation and contact tracing to stay open, to continue to do the things that we love. What we're starting with is relying upon kind of some normal authorities, like the school committees and some of the decisions in schools. But as the governor clarified yesterday, he still has those authorities. So I think what we're watching closely, and we're definitely at an inflection point, we've seen cases potentially begin to plateau, but it's very early. We've also seen hospitalizations continue to rise over the last few days. So I think within the next week or so, we'll have a clear view of what that trend is likely to be, and that will guide some of the policy decisions moving forward.
Things could still change in the this is not the way we are today, might not be where we are a week from now, depending on the data.
That's correct.
What would be your advice? I'm fully vaccinated. I can't say I've been wearing a mask too frequently because you're not told to, and I felt fairly protected because, as you said, the vaccines are very effective. But what would you tell, whether it's me or someone else who is fully vaccinated, does not have a young child or immunocompromised person at home, going into the supermarket, going into CVS? Would you say we should be wearing masks? We should right now. That's absolutely our recommendation. The big thing is, while we're experiencing substantial and high levels of community transmission, there is still a risk even if you're fully vaccinated. And though you might not be hospitalized, and that's a good thing, the vaccines are working. I know I was quarantined, I was isolated last year. That's a huge disruption and impact across the state, and you factor in children as well. And then also trying to reduce that community transmission, because we know, though while reduced and representing a very small percentage of the spread, fully vaccinated people that are symptomatic, can spread. So for me, one of the easiest things we can do is wear a mask. And at this point, with vaccines and treatments, we know that we can get on the backside of this, on the backside of Delta, in the next 45 to 60 days. This isn't like where we were last winter, where we were waiting on vaccines and we didn't know what that timeline looked like. So an extra bit of vigilance to ensure our students can learn in person safely, we can continue to do the things that we enjoy, and we'll all be in good shape. I can, though, imagine, Tom, some viewers at home listening and saying, well, wait a minute, we thought that's where we were in April and May, and we weren't even talking about the Delta variant then, and now all of a sudden we're kind of back in the soup because what about if there's another variant? Could that happen again? Could it keep mutating and then we keep having these cycles? So it absolutely could, and what I would say is, I think, for me, what we can do to ensure Rhode Island is in the best position and prepared for whatever may come next, because less than 20% of the global population is vaccinated. So there's always that potential for further mutations and variants, is to get as many people vaccinated as possible. With the Alpha variant, we had vaccinated enough Rhode Islanders. We were at the lowest case count since the beginning of the pandemic, but Delta changed the game, and what it did is it took hold in our unvaccinated communities and spread from there. So we don't know what the future may hold, but what we do know is that every variant that we've seen has been responsive and highly responsive so far to being vaccinated. So getting as close to 100% vaccination is absolutely critical, not just for Delta, but to ensure we're ready for anything that may come after. You alluded to it earlier, so that you're looking at, and we've heard this also from Dr. McDonald at the Health Department, a peak potentially of the spread of Delta in Rhode Island around the beginning of September, right as kids are going back, right as a large group of unvaccinated people start to gather in these classrooms, potentially spreading the virus. I guess, what's your biggest concern right now about starting school, particularly since it's not clear to me yet, maybe you've seen something else, that every city and town is going to want to put in an individual municipal mask mandate for these young school children? My number one concern, and I have 2 school-age children, is having that mask requirement in place. What we did really well last year is we partnered with our school communities, and we've continued to refine
that testing program, the asymptomatic testing program. Ventilation, we know some of our buildings are older, but we've found ways to ensure that we can provide safe environments from a ventilation standpoint. My big concern, especially when I'm seeing schools open early down south where they don't have mask mandates in place, we're seeing large numbers of students that are quarantined in isolation, in and out of in-person instruction, which is highly disruptive for the entire family. And to me, it's assuming unnecessary risk. I think looking at really that first month of school specifically and then reevaluating from there, this is not what it's going to look like for the whole school year. But while we know and have proven what works in Rhode Island, I'm concerned now, given some of the conversations we've seen at school committees over the last week, that we're not being direct enough about the masking requirements. So, the governor clarified yesterday, we're going to continue to support the school districts and the school committees in developing the right policies. We've been meeting with them frequently over the summer. But there are several policy options on the table to ensure that our students are going back to school safely.
So certainly it is not off the table for you to do it at the state level if it came to that.
Yeah, I don't think the governor's taking anything off the table.
So the governor also mentioned there are a couple consultants working with your team in Rhode to help get the schools reopened safely. What are you having them look at? What kind of work are they doing?
Yeah, so some of the consultants that we're working with, so as you know, last year we had the Education Operations Center with our National Guard partners, which was just phenomenal, allowed us to accomplish what we did last year. So nationally, as some of those missions are winding down, the consultants coming in to help kind of fill some of those roles with regards to the integration and the direct supports for school districts. And one of the biggest things right now is working through the what ifs and the contingency planning. Are we prepared for if we have a certain number of bus drivers are out or a certain number of positive cases in a classroom? Things of that nature. So that's been the primary focus of their support.
Let's talk a little about testing. In the springtime, and before I was fully vaccinated due to which age cohort I was in, I was getting tested every week because I teach at a college, and that was the requirement for the college at the time. And by the late spring, it couldn't have been more convenient. I have to say, sometimes I'd be here at work, I'd say, I'm going to have a little window at lunch break. I'd go on and you could make an appointment, a half-hour drive through the convention center, be back at work and get your test later that day. And then this week, for the first time in a while, I said, maybe I should get a test, as we're reading about Delta. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot harder to find an appointment. Now, I later learned, thanks to viewers who wrote back to me on Twitter, that you could literally walk up to a place at the convention center, and I did get a test. But, were you caught by surprise how fast the demand for testing went back up in the last couple weeks?
So one thing we've always tried to make sure we have when it comes to vaccination or testing is, while being good stewards of the taxpayer money, having more capacity than we think we're going to need. So we never exceeded our ability to provide same-day appointments. But one thing that's different now than before is we're seeing demand for testing twice as high at this case rate than it was previously. I think a lot of that speaks to...
How quickly did that happen, versus when?
Within a week.
Really?
So the seriousness that people are taking the Delta variant. So what we're going to continue to do, I think yesterday we maxed out about 70% of our available appointments. We have 5,000 appointments available at state-run sites. That's on top of hospitals, pharmacies, and other. We're going to ramp that back up to what we saw previously in the winter, about 8,000 appointments each day, 2,000 dedicated just to K through 12 to make sure, people, I want to provide as much certainty as possible going into September. Testing is not going to be something people are going to have to worry about.
One last question, we have to go to the break, but Tom, what's the best advice to the average Rhode Islander watching today if they decide they want to test? Is it still go to portal.ri.gov?
Absolutely, portal.ri.gov, and then we have pop-up clinics throughout communities, so your local community leaders, in the newspaper and the media will see information about that, but portal.ri.gov for your appointments is your best bet.
All right, Tom McCarthy, head of COVID response for the state of Rhode Island. Thank you for being with me. And coming up on the second half, we're going to talk to one of the people who's already thrown their hat in the ring to run against Charlie Baker, if Charlie Baker runs again. Stick with us on Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Ted Nesi. Tim White is off this week. Well, The biggest question in Massachusetts politics right now is whether Charlie Baker will seek a third term as governor in 2022. But already candidates are lining up to run regardless of whether the incumbent seeks re-election. And I'm joined today by one of those candidates, former state senator Ben Downing, one of 3 Democrats currently seeking their party's gubernatorial nomination so far. Ben, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ted. Appreciate it.
First, I have to say, for our Rhode Island viewers, you did spend a few formative years in the Ocean State, right?
Yeah, I did, as did my dad. So I grew up hearing stories about Ernie D. and Marvin Barnes and watching Providence College basketball, and proud graduate of '03 from Providence College. So it's a special place in my family. My kid brother went there as well, so we've got deep ties to the city and to the region.
Yeah, not a bad place to learn the art of politics.
Not at all. Not at all.
At PC in the Cianci area. Yeah. So, all right, let's talk about your run. So, as I mentioned, we don't know if Charlie Baker's going to run yet. He has not said so yet. He certainly is taking steps. If he wants to, he could. And you know the score. I'm sure you get asked this a million times. He's always his polling numbers are always so high. He's always one of the most popular governors. He seems like he's Teflon. If Charlie Baker does run, I'm sure people are wondering home, how could you expect to beat him?
Yeah, so I think first I got in not knowing he'd run because the reason I'm running, had been there whether Charlie Baker's been there or not. It's a political culture on Beacon Hill that too often is left behind the communities that I live in, the communities that I call home. And I think what we're out there talking to folks on the campaign trail about is about how we bring the experiences of Pittsfield, of New Bedford, of Fall River, of Lowell and Lawrence more to the center of our debate to make sure those communities get the support that they need. And the way you go out there and the way you win a race is not by running against one candidate, but by going out there and listening, learning, and then making a case for how you can address the tangible needs of people in their community every day. And I think that's how we do it. You got to build trust, you have to earn trust, and then you make the case about how Governor Baker has not used that significant popularity to go out and use that and actually improve the lives in those communities. You know
the polling. Polls show that he's not all that popular in his own Republican Party because he's opposes Trump sometimes, but Democrats always give him very high scores. And does that make you reflect at all? Maybe members of your own party prefer that sort of low-key, don't make too many waves style versus some of the more transformative things you and other Democrats think is needed?
Yeah, I think Governor Baker has benefited from the comparison to the mess that we've seen in Washington for the previous 4 years. And I think now that we have thankfully turned the page on that chapter, more folks are looking at where are we in Massachusetts? Are we actually taking on the big issues around climate, around economic fairness, around racial justice? What has Governor Baker done with the last 6 years? Has our transportation system improved? Has our housing stock improved? Has schools improved? Have childcare wait lists gotten less? They haven't on any number of different fronts. So while being better than bad might be okay for the last 4 years, it's not good enough moving forward if we're going to build a fairer, stronger Massachusetts.
You're from Pittsfield, as you mentioned, and I look out for New Bedford, Fall River, Attleboro in this television market. I grew up in Attleboro, so I also know how places that aren't greater Boston, those inner ring suburbs, can feel kind of ignored by Beacon Hill. You were in the state Senate. You know the folks up there. I mean, how real is that versus the perception, the chip on the shoulder in some of the other parts of Massachusetts? And how do you change that? Because in the end, there's just a lot of people in greater Boston and a lot of money in greater Boston.
Yeah, so first, it's absolutely real. The dominant political conversation at the State House is a Boston-centric conversation, and that's important. It's the capital. It's the biggest city in the region. It's important. But what it misses out on is the opportunities presented by those other communities and the fact that some of the challenges Boston is facing come from us not building stronger economies outside of the area. So when you look at sky-high housing prices in and around greater Boston, yes, part of that is because we haven't invested in affordable housing. It's also because we haven't built strong economies in Attleboro, in New Bedford, Fall River, Pittsfield, Springfield, Holyoke. You build a stronger economy out there, you're able to build the housing stock in and around those areas and take advantage of, relatively speaking, more affordable housing. So we need to be able to not only look at the needs of the capital city, but also see the opportunities that are presented in our gateway cities to build a fairer, stronger economy for everyone.
And yet, and you know this, it feels sometimes like it's going in the opposite direction, that things are getting sucked even more toward Boston. And of course, I'd say Massachusetts is better off having Boston than not having Boston, to be clear. Nothing against Boston. I grew up rooting for the Red Sox. But, how do you when there are forces much bigger than Massachusetts driving cities to thrive while sort of outlying areas struggle to get a footing in this economy, what can the state government do, a governor working with Beacon Hill, that you think would make a difference?
So first, it's just an approach to the job, Ted. We have to have a greater sense of urgency. We can't just shrug our shoulders and say, hey, they're global trends. What are we to do about it? We do have power in the ability to shape those trends. What we shouldn't be doing is giving incentives to companies to go into the seaport. That's the hottest real estate market in the region. Instead, we should be prioritizing those resources to rebuild economies in Lowell and Lawrence, in New Bedford and Fall River, in Pittsfield and Springfield, to be able to address some of that inequity and the imbalance that we see in those communities. And again, not just see those communities as challenges, but see the opportunities that are present in those communities. We're starting to see that in New Bedford with the growth of the offshore wind industries there. We're starting to see that as we're finally building South Coast Rail, and that actually has a plan to become real. So it's about seeing the potential and the opportunities in those communities, and then having a sense of urgency from our leadership that is going to focus on that nonstop.
Are they still giving incentives to build in the seaport?
Yes, that's how GE was going there. Other companies have gone there, right? And that's all while they were fighting a cleanup in my hometown, right? And that wasn't a wise use of resources from the beginning.
Yeah, actually, it shows I don't cover Boston day to day, but my goodness. Let's talk policy. You mentioned housing. You and I are both, unfortunately, I believe we're now called geriatric millennials as the older edge of our generation. And so I'm sure we both, being people in our 30s, have a lot of friends who've struggled to find a house, whether that's Massachusetts or Rhode Island. But we also know there is massive, massive resistance to building much significant new housing in both states and frankly across the Northeast. So what do you and by the way, I should say, Governor Baker has talked about this a lot too. I can't say it's something he's ignored either, and yet it's very hard to move the needle. What do you think could make a difference and actually start to bring down these soaring housing prices for middle and working class families?
So I think one of the things we need to recognize from the start, Ted, is that while there is resistance, I believe it is a loud and vocal minority, right? And yes, we have taken some small steps to take away the power from that minority and to empower the broader majority in communities that want to be welcoming, that want new community members, that want to be able to build new housing. We need to make sure that we're building more affordable housing, building more multifamily housing, and building it near transportation hubs to be able to connect people to jobs. You shouldn't have to be in a car to get to your economic opportunities. You shouldn't have to be in a car to get to your school to run every last errand. So I think it's critically important not only that we invest more in transportation, we continue to make it easier to build in Massachusetts and build closer to those transportation hubs, and then we're going to be able to actually start to see some of these housing prices come down over time. But it requires a sense of urgency. And again, this is where Governor Baker and his sky-high approval ratings reflect a missed opportunity. He hasn't used that popularity to take on this challenge with a sense of urgency that we need.
What would be your top priority? You have to go around, you're a candidate, you have to go tell every interest group their priority is your priority, but you also have to make choices if you were to be governor. What would be top of mind?
Climate. Massachusetts will be the next state to join the dozen or so states that have a commitment to get to 100% clean electricity by 2030, 100% clean energy by 2040. These are the issues I worked on in the state Senate and led on when I wrote the bill that created the offshore wind industry that we're starting to finally see come to fruition. These are the issues I worked on in the private sector. We have the solutions. What's been missing is the leadership to tap into that potential and bring those solutions to reality.
But I also know electricity costs, energy costs are already very high in the Northeast, and especially in some of the poorer cities, there can be concerns that pushing for aggressive climate policies will only exacerbate affordability problems for working class communities. How do you, and that's not to downplay the seriousness of the climate problem, but how do you balance that?
So these are very real concerns. I sat in schools with factory workers and members who are dealing with factories that had closed that had been open for generations, and they closed because of sky-high utility rates that had spiked without their involvement and their know-how. But the answer for them, right, the answer in those factories and everyone across Western Mass and many of the communities we talked about in Southeastern Mass, right, isn't to try to build another pipeline and to try to get another 5 years, another 10 years out of fossil fuels that's going to sacrifice the future. It's about building that future and capturing those opportunities here. And we're seeing plummeting costs when it comes to solar energy. offshore wind, battery storage technology, and energy efficiency. You need a governor that can bring together all of that potential, that knows the hurdles that stand in the way, to make sure that as we make that transition, we bring everyone along. This is about creating economic opportunity, not losing it. We can do so in a way that works for everyone.
We spent the first half talking about the pandemic, obviously in Rhode Island, basically the same issues facing Massachusetts. This is a pretty tight area. If you were governor today, what, if anything, would you be doing differently right now in August 2021 about the pandemic response in Massachusetts?
Massachusetts should have a statewide mask mandate. It's the clarity that school districts need right now. Unfortunately, as we've seen time and time again throughout the COVID response, Governor Baker has left school districts, municipal leaders, left business leaders to try to come up with their own patchwork set of responses to a time where we need certainty from state government and state leadership. We should have a statewide mandate. It's not where any of us want to be at this point, but we know there's more work to do on vaccination. We know there's more work to do to close the inequities that we've seen in our response. The mask mandate makes sure that kids can get back to school, that we can get back to work in the safest way possible while we beat back Delta.
Ben Downing, candidate for Massachusetts governor, thanks for coming down to share your thoughts with Southeastern Massachusetts, and thank you for being with us this week on Newsmakers. Tim White will be back next week with me. Remember, if you missed this episode or any other episode of the show, you can find it all on WPRI.com. You can also find our podcast on iTunes and get it on your phone every week. See you back here next week on Newsmakers.